Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about introducing sparring to your school, part 2. By this point, I'm expecting that you probably have an idea about which direction you want to go as an instructor, whether you do no armor, just so you practice that more the mental aspect, or if you go in terms of the equipment. So at this point, I expect that you've kind of figured out which one you want to do. And then also, I'm assuming that you're going to follow me in terms of going into the flower point HEMA rule set in terms of sparring, because that's the one I think works the most, and it's the one that works best with our Gumdo mentality. So with those two assumptions in mind, how do we start teaching people to hit each other, right? Because it's not something that's part of our general training. We do basics, we do forms, we do some skills drills, we do all these other things, but we don't usually hit each other with swords, although we have the equipment to do so. So if you're brand new to it, how do you introduce it to either yourself or your students? One thing you could do pretty early on to introduce the idea of making contact with a partner is introduce this during focuses or during your kyakam. Now technically the kyakam are associated with the first degree material, but I tend to teach it to my color belts. Mostly because, like, so for example, the first kyakam, which is a black belt material, is actually based on Sangsu 1, which is a white belt material. So in general, one thing that I do is I teach the kyakam along with the Sangsu users, with which the curriculum was actually derived for, right? So if it's based on Form 1, I teach it when they're doing Form 1, Form 2, etc., etc. You can introduce this pretty early on, right? So for example, if I am going to do these parts of the defense focus, right? So if I'm going through the motions this way, what I can do against it is actually going to be have a partner, probably both with safety swords, so this is not a safety sword, but both using safety swords. So when I'm doing my 11 block, they're going to try to do a center cut. Now they're not trying to hit my sword. This is the really, really big thing. Don't hit the sword, try to hit me, and I'm going to stop you, right? So center cuts, cross cut to the neck. So you're going to do pushing 45 block, or pao sung se block, and keep going, right? So diagonal cut, you're going to do the 45s, and etc., etc. So you can do this with a partner very, very early on, because it's introducing the idea of your individual blocks. It's introducing the idea of actually hitting the opponent as opposed to the sword. So the focuses are a good way for you to introduce this pretty early on, as well as the kyakam. In case you need a refresher about what the kyakam are, I'm going to call them one-steps because that's what we call them in our Taekwondo for a nice quick application. But in general, there's the palto, there's the actual interaction with the swords, and then there's the kyakam. So for example, number 1, I'm not going to necessarily do this in the teaching mode, right? So you draw, you do your combination, right? And you also learn how to defend against that combination, and then you put it away. So the reason why it's usually designated to first degree is it's not mandatory for you to have a metal sword until your first degree, which is a whole different thing. So a very quick side note without putting too much emphasis on it is I recommend you use a metal sword as soon as possible because you are a swordsman. I'm going to leave it at that. But that's why it's designated for first degree, although it's associated with the color belt forms. I usually teach this with the color belts. So we can start with that, right? So again, we start off a good distance, and then we draw against each other. At this point, we want to be pretty close, right? So about like a fist between the two tips. So I'm going to go in, trying to strike my opponent. So again, the main thing is you're not hitting the sword, you're aiming for the opponent that way. So I'm trying to hit their head, trying to hit their torso, and then defense, right? And then when they're trying to hit my head, I'm trying not to die, I'm going back into defense, like so. And you can do this for all of the kyakam, right? So you can do it for 1, 2, etc., etc., etc. And that'll be another good way for you to start applying it against a partner. After you've introduced the idea of actually hitting the partner, not the sword, we can start to kind of branch out a little bit more, right? So we've kind of done the major federation things with regard to actually hitting each other. Now obviously you can apply your form against a partner, you can apply different parts of the curricula against a partner, but after a certain point you just have to start aiming for a partner kind of in a more freestyle way. So the way I usually introduce it is, so if they're brand new, I might again do the focuses first. If they're a color belt, I might do their kyakan. But almost immediately I start doing something a little bit different. So obviously this is going to be more from my own personal experience. But what I like to do is, so we have a partner drill. We're going to only focus on one cut. So in this case, if we just start with the center cut, they're going to do a center cut against the opponent. I'm going to teach the attacker 3 ways to actually land that center cut. And I'm going to teach the defender 3 ways to defend. And they're going to keep going at it that way. So what we usually do is this person, right? So I'm just going to say this is the attacker, this is the defender. So for example, if I want to land that center cut, I'm going to face you, right? So one thing that I'm not as happy with regard to the kyakan is it assumes your opponent's an idiot, right? So for example, the first one's like, I'm going to center cut you. Now, if I see someone who just does this, I'm going to stab them in the face and then either back off to the side so I can evade that momentum. That's not smart, right? Like you just don't want that. So there are a couple ways you can actually try to hit that center cut. So I'm going to primarily use the center cut as a primary way of teaching this. So for example, 3 ways to do it. Right, so from here, you can pressure, so you can pressure off to one side, and then as they try to push you back online, so you're pressuring, you're going to come up, center cut, right? So that way, if I'm pressuring this way, they're trying to push me back online, or try to push me away, and when I let go, their sword is going to be like, huh, I'm going to come with that center cut. So that's one way you can attack. Another way is to pressure other side, sliding in, center. As well as a couple other things, right? So again, there's the nice duck under that people like to do. You can try to do almost like Sangsu 6's kyakan, where you draw down center cut. So there's going to be tons of ways for you to do this. I just picked three of the easiest for my students to learn. I usually do the pressure one just because it introduces another idea. So what I do is the attacker goes through the first one several times, right? So that's really all they're trying to do. All they're trying to do is land that center cut. I'm not trying to make the partner work their combination. I'm trying to land my center. So if we do that, right? So if I pressure and 1, 2, right? That's going to again force them to react. So I go and teach 3 ways to attack, 3 ways to defend. So obviously the biggest one is if I'm being deflected this way, go for an 11 block. If I'm being deflected this way, go for an X block. That's like the easiest one, that's the one that's most canonical, but there are other ways. So for example, if I see that center cut coming in, I can broadside, center cut. I can also, so if I let it happen, right, I can evade off to the side and block. But that's a general idea, right? So the attacker learns 3 ways to land that center cut. The defender learns 3 ways to defend against it, right? So what I'd like to do is each of them are working on that particular combination. We switch, so now this one's an attacker, this one's on defense. And then at that point, I want them to do random, right? So don't consistently do the pressure into your center cut, mix it up, right? So do the push down center cut, do the switch center cut. So while this person is going to be like, all right, so I'm not going to just do the 11 block, I might do the evasion with the 11 block and all fun stuff. So that way, each person knows it's a center cut that's happening, so they can train for that specific inevitability when they do hear or see a center cut coming towards you. But each of them are trying to learn how to land and how to defend against it. I know that was really long-winded, but let me, I guess, simplify into a more concrete idea, and we can keep going. Take one cut, find 3 ways to make it land, 3 ways to defend against it. Have your partner do the first one, second one, third one. This person mixes it up. This one only does this one. This one mixes it up again, only this one. Mixes it up, only this one. Now, switch. This is the offense, defense. So again, number 1 against number 1. Number 2 against number 2. Number 3 against number 3. Number 1 against any of these. Number 2 against any of these. 3 against any of these. And then, once they're both used to trying to land and trying to defend, completely random for all of them. This looks really weird, but completely random for all of them. So they get used to seeing the same cut from different orientations, as well as being able to defend from any orientation. So after that, I like to keep introducing new ideas with it. So after they're used to doing random, right? So I randomly try to get my center cut in, they randomly kind of try to defend. So now the defender also counters, right? So now I attack, they defend, and then try to cut again. So that way you're not learning just to defend, you're learning how to still win the match. So again, after that point, so random against each other, just adding a counter at the end. You can have a counter to the counter if you want, but after a while it just kind of loses itself. So I would recommend at least adding the counter to the end of really any combination. You can also add the counter to the end of any of your kyukums or any of your basics as well, just to introduce fresh ideas. And from there, you just keep doing different cuts, right? So go into a diagonal. Here are 3 ways to make it land. Here are 3 ways to defend against it. And eventually get to random, and then add a counter if you're on the defense, and all that fun stuff. And once they get used to that, we're gonna have one more thing. That's gonna be no one person is on the offense and no one person is on the defense. Whoever thinks they can land a cut is gonna go for that cut, right? So it's not like, oh, you can't do that, I'm the offensive person. No, right? So like, that's not how fighting works, right? So either one can instigate the attack after a while. So the biggest thing I would recommend is have order and structure to how you teach, because the more nebulous the idea, the more confused your students might be. So be very, very concrete with how you're teaching them, and be consistent about it. And then once they're comfortable with it, then you can change things up once again. Now obviously, these combinations are going to be different for each individual school, because each individual person has their own different fighting style. So for example, what I do with my students is a combination of all the sword martial arts I've trained with. So there's a little bit of, kendo kote strikes. There's a lot of mizani strikes from my HEMA experience. So it's a really big mix of a lot of different things, but you don't necessarily have to do what I do on this channel. You are an instructor, or you're someone who's intending to be an instructor or master in the future, right? So see what works for you, right? So if you've only done Gumdo, find combinations from your forms and from your basics and all that fun stuff. Learn how to apply them in new ways. So for example, one thing that makes Gumdo, I won't call it unique because there are other martial arts that do this as well, but we have a lot more of an emphasis on using what I'm going to call the false edge, so the back of the sword. So if you take a look at even something as early on as Form 2, right? So one way you can interpret Form 2 is you can hit with the back of the sword, hit, cut, right? So also Form 3, right? Hitting with the back of the sword, hitting up, down, cut. So we use a lot more of the back of the sword. Try to see how you can make that land. Also keep in mind how close you want to be to the Federation and their guidelines. As you guys might know by the content that I produce, I'm a little bit on the weird side. I'm willing to kind of diverge a little bit from the Federation without contradicting it. So for example, if you ever do see me spar, I use a lot of different kinds of stances and guards that aren't necessarily from the Federation. So with regard to that, as a master, you have to start making those decisions as well. How strict do you want to be to the Federation and their guards, or are you willing to be more open to different kinds of techniques? So for example, a guard that I like to use is actually, a couple of them. So I'd like to use this one, which is Boar's Tooth in HEMA, because I like to do the stabs, right? Now that does not happen in the Federation. Likewise, I also like to use this guard from Kendo, which is Gaidon. Just because it's nice and low, I can use a lot of different techniques from below to strike. Those, again, don't happen in the Federation, so if you are more strict about your adherence to it, then don't do those, right? So just kind of see where you're comfortable with as an instructor and see how much you're willing to diverge from the norm. In future videos, I'm going to probably post individual combinations that I would recommend for new starters and stuff like that. I would like for me to be able to use my students as people with whom I can demonstrate these combinations, but pandemic and all that fun stuff, and also making sure that everything is safe while I do it. So that's going to happen probably in the future. So for your drills, what I would like for you to do is, so first of all, decide whether or not you really want to spar. And if you do want to spar, and I highly recommend that you do, what sort of flavor do you want, right? So we talked about like the different sparring rule sets. We talked about the equipment that you can use. What vision do you have for your particular sword sparring? Do you want to be very, dramatic like the Federation? Do you want to be very spiritual kind of minded like Kendo? Or do you want a little more like geometric and a lot more pragmatic like HEMA? So that's really going to be up to you. So you as an instructor should probably decide which way you want to go. But on top of that, also think about 3 different ways. So we didn't talk about crosscut. So find 3 ways you can actually land a crosscut, right? So assuming that you're in middle guard, just because that's how most of us are going to start, unless if you're weird like me, try to figure out how I can go from here to here without making it too weird, right? So find 3 ways for you to still land that crosscut, and also find 3 ways you can very easily defend against a crosscut. So I'm also choosing crosscut because it's allegedly one of the harder ones to block. That's why we usually evade back away from the crosscut. But there are actually quite a few fun ways you can do that. So for example, just to give you some ideas, if I see a crosscut coming, first of all, I'm going to go for the face, because if they can't swing their sword if they lose their face. But another thing you can do is just strike the sword out and then strike their head, right? To do kind of what Kendo would look like with the Kote Men, right? So ban, ban, if you want to. So just figure out 3 ways you can counter any particular cut. And then see if your students are willing to kind of play with that, or if you have a student that you want, like an instructor or something like that, for you to play with as well, go with that as well. But with that, with this one particularly, stay safe, right? So stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong